Hello, beautiful lights, and welcome to another episode of From a Medium's Perspective. Today, it's just me and you, and I'm going to talk to you today about jinn, men, and angels. You might be going, what did she say, jinn, like the booze? No, it's spelled Jinn. And I first heard about the jinn from my now ex-husband. He's a Muslim, and he was born in Alexandria, Egypt. He grew up hearing stories of the jinn, and he was really knowledgeable about the Quran, and he explained to me that the jinn are made of fire, angels were made of light, and people were made of earth. Well, I knew from my Christian upbringing that angels were made from light, and mankind was made from earth, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. From earth we come, and to earth we shall return. But jinn, the idea of beings made from fire, now that really fascinated me. And so I chose it for today's topic, basically so I could learn a little bit more about them. I had an inkling that they might just correlate to the kingdoms of nature spirits and discarnate beings that I and possibly you encounter on occasion. But I didn't have any idea that it would bring me full circle, from jinn to familiars, to angels, to elementals, to totems, and to guides. It's the confirmation of what I experience as a seer and medium, and must be a universal phenomenon. Now, whether we're talking about elementals or guides or totems, animals, jinn, demons, there is always darkness and light around us. And to be perfectly honest, darkness and light also exists within us as well, doesn't it? Now, it just depends on where we choose to put our focus, because energy follows focus. Our energy follows our focus. If our thoughts are filled with fear and hatred and judgment, well, there you go. But if our thoughts are filled with excitement and love and acceptance, well now, doesn't that feel better? So let's talk about jinn. According to dictionary.com, it is the plural word of genie. And you're saying, what? Genie? Yup. But that's correctly spelled Jinni, genie. Genie is the singular form, and jinn is the collective or plural form. So genie is one, and jinn is all of them. Dictionary.com said that the jinn are any class of spirits lower than the angels, capable of appearing in human and animal form and influencing mankind for either good or evil. They broadly classify the jinn as the collective of beings that are generally invisible to the average human, those of demons, spirits, and angels. They say that the jinn were said to appear most commonly in the shapes of serpents, dogs, cats, or human beings, and that the sea could be influenced by the mischief of the jinn. The Urban Dictionary says that the jinn are invisible spirits, neither human nor angelic, credited with the ability to inform soothsayers and inspire poets. They said that the jinn were called to serve God. The English word genie comes from the Arabic word genie, or jinni, or jinnai, and the jinn are mentioned many times throughout the Quran. The Quran is the holy book of Islam. Wikipedia goes into a bit more depth and says that the primary meaning of jinn is to hide. Now, some authors interpret the word to mean literally beings that are concealed from the senses. Another interpretation is Jannah. Jannah means garden and is, I know, the word that's used for heaven in Arabic, Jannah. And Janine is embryo. Very interesting, because we think of embryo as the beginning of creation. That's just so interesting. So Wikipedia goes on and says that the anglicized form genie is borrowed from the French genie, from the Latin genius, a guardian spirit of people and places, according to Roman religion. The archaeological evidence found in northwestern Arabia seems to indicate the worship of jinn, or at least of their tributary status. Hundreds of years before Islam, this existed, and they found an Aramaic inscription. Aramaic was the language that Jesus spoke, from Beth Faisal near Palmyra, and it pays tribute to the Genii, the good and the rewarding gods. Numerous mentions of the jinn in the Quran and the testimony of both pre-Islamic and Islamic literature indicate that the belief in spirits was predominant in pre-Islamic Bedouin religion. The Bedouins are the nomadic people of the Middle East. However, there's evidence that the word jinn is derived from Aramaic, where it was used by Christians to designate pagan gods, which were reduced in Christian tradition to the status of demons. And that was introduced into Arabic folklore late in the pre-Islamic era. They say that in Islamic theology, jinn are said to be creatures with free will. They're made from smokeless fire by Allah, or God. Allah is just the name God in Arabic. If you were to say God and you were saying it in Arabic, it would be Allah or Allah. As humans were made by clay. And so that was really where my husband was talking about them being made out of fire, and they say a smokeless fire, and that people were made of clay, among other things. According to the Quran, jinn have free will, and Iblis disobeyed God and refused to bow down to Adam when the angels and jinn were ordered to do so. Doesn't that sound familiar to you Christians out there who heard about Lucifer, the angel of light, disobeying God and refusing to bow down and becoming Satan? Interesting. So Iblis is the equivalent of Satan in the Quran. For disobeying God, Iblis was expelled from paradise and called Shaitan. And I guess that would be familiar to our Jewish and Christian listeners. Jinn are frequently mentioned in the Quran, and they have a surah that's named after the jinn, Surat al-Jinn, and there's a passage about them. There's another surah that mentions jinn in the last verse, and also mentions that Muhammad was sent as a prophet to both humanity and the jinn, and that the prophets and messengers are sent to both communities of human and jinn populations. It's interesting to think about, too. They usually are invisible to humans, but humans do appear clearly to the jinn and can possess them. Jinn have power to travel large distances at extreme speeds, and they're thought to live in remote areas like mountains, seas, trees, the air, sort of the elemental aspects, water, earth, air, etc., and in their own communities. Like humans, jinn will also be judged at the day of judgment according to the Quran, and will be sent either to paradise or hell according to their deeds. And there's some classifications and characteristics of jinn that are given. Again, Wikipedia. Al-Malik al-Aswad, meaning the Black King of Jinns, is talked about in the Book of Wonders, and that was a book that was written in the late 14th century, quite a ways ago there. And the social organization of the jinn community resembles that of humans. They have kings, courts of law, weddings, and mourning rituals. One other common belief in Muslim lore lists 5 distinct orders of jinn. There's the Marid, which are the strongest, the Ifrit, which go below that, the Shaitan, the Ghoul, and I thought, oh, that sounds like our word for scary ghosts, Ghoul or Jinn, and the Jann, the weakest type. Few traditions, according to the Hadith, divide the jinn into 3 classes: those who have wings and fly in the air, and those who resemble snakes and dogs, and those who travel about ceaselessly, describing them as creatures of different forms, sometimes resembling vultures or snakes, other time tall men in white garb. They may even appear as dragons, donkeys, or a number of other animals. In addition to their animal form, the jinn occasionally assume human form to mislead or try to destroy. And even grislier, certain hadiths, which are additional scripture, long story, we'll do that in another show when we have an Islamic perspective on ghosts, angels, and the afterlife. Anyway, certain hadiths have also claimed that the jinn may subsist on bones and will grow flesh again as soon as they touch them, and that their animals might live on dung, which will revert to grain or grass for the use of the jinn flocks. That's so weird. Anyway, in Surat al-Rahman, verse 33, God reminds the jinn as well as mankind that they would possess the ability to pass beyond the furthest reaches of space, but only by his authority. And by answering the question properly, then which of the favors of your Lord will you deny? So I guess that gives them and us as humans an option to raise their vibration and ascend to the highest realms of light. There is a related belief in that every person is assigned one's own special genie, also called a Karin, and I'm probably not pronouncing that well. It might be Karin. If the Karin is evil, it could whisper to people's souls and tell them to submit to evil desires. Sort of our cartoonish notion of a devil sitting on one shoulder and an angel on the other. The notion of a Karin is not universally accepted among all Muslims, but on the other hand, most Muslims do believe that Shaitan can whisper in human minds and that he is assigned to each human being, similar to the Christian concept of temptation. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that there is not one of you who does not have a genie appointed to be his constant companion, a Karin. They said, and you too, O Messenger of Allah. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, me too. But Allah has helped me and he has submitted so that only he helps me to do good, which again brings up that concept of our will to choose light or dark and to sort of set the energy and the vibration about us. The stories of the jinn can be found in various Muslim cultures around the world. The concept of the genie has become part of the local folklore, which includes stories of both male jinn and female jinn. And they call the male jinn jinn, and they call the female jinn jinniri. You might have heard the jinn in one story. You might have even read this, 1001 Nights. It's in, I think, 3 of the stories. It's in The Fisherman and the Genie. There are more than 3 different types of jinn that are described in that story. Maruf the Cobbler, where a mighty genie helps a young Aladdin in the story of Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. As Hassan Badr al-Din weeps over the grave of his father until sleep overcomes him, he is awoken by a large group of sympathetic jinn in the tale of Al-Nur al-Din and his son Badr. During the Rwandan genocide, both the Hutus and the Tutsis avoid searching in a local Rwandan Muslim neighborhood and widely believed the myths that local Muslims and mosques were protected by the power of Islamic magic and the work and power of the jinn. Arsonists ran away instead of destroying the mosque because they believed that the jinn were guarding the mosque in Cyangugu and feared their wrath. According to several traditions, the jinn stood behind the learned humans in Solomon's court, and yes, that's the Solomon of the Bible as well, who in turn sat behind the prophets. That's kind of interesting to think about the jinn standing behind humans and the humans sitting behind the prophets. The jinn remained in the service of Solomon who had placed them in bondage and ordered them to perform a number of tasks. And before Solomon gathered his hosts of jinn and men and birds, they were all kept in order and ranks. And I find that very interesting because that's how we think of our spirit guides. The Quran relates that Solomon died while he was leaning on his staff, and because he died standing up, he was propped on his staff. The jinn that were under his command thought that he was still alive and supervising them, so they continued to work, and they only realized the truth when God sent a worm to crawl out of the ground and gnaw the bottom of Solomon's staff until his body collapsed. The Quran says that if they had known the unseen, they wouldn't have stayed in the torment of being enslaved to the will of Solomon. And that brings me back to an idea, too, that is true, and we often don't realize it. We sometimes think of spirits as being very powerful, especially those that are maybe a little annoying or predatory. But we are given the authority to command spirits. That's just part of our perk for coming down in the earth. Material will trumps spirit in general, not spiritual will and higher will, but beings in the spiritual realm, we do have authority over that. Ibn al-Nadim, in his Kitab al-Firist, that's a book that lists 70 jinn that were led by Fuctus, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Fuctus, including 7 jinn kings that were appointed over every day of the week. So that was a host of jinn plus 7 that were appointed over each day of the week. A collection of late 14th or early 15th century magico-medical manuscripts from Spain describe a different set of 72 jinn, blaming them for various ailments. And according to these manuscripts, each jinn was brought before King Solomon and ordered to divulge their corruption and residence, while the jinn king Fikitush gave Solomon a recipe for curing the ailments associated with each jinn as they confessed their transgressions. There was spiritual wisdom given to Solomon about the cure for 72 diseases through his guides. In other cultures, the jinn are mentioned. Leland Windsor wrote about Aladdin and the genie in the lamp. And in the Canary Islands, there existed a belief in beings that are similar to genies, such as the Maxios or Dioses Paredros, which mean attendant gods or domestic and nature spirits, and Tibicenas, which are evil genies, as well as the demon Guayato, which is an aboriginal god of evil that, like the Arabic Iblis, is sometimes identified with a genie. Van Dyck did an Arabic translation of the Old Testament and uses an alternative word, Jan, to render the Hebrew word into English as familiar spirit. You can find that in Strong's Concordance, number 0178 for reference, and it's mentioned in several places in the Old Testament. So there's this concept of jinn as beings of fire that are between men and the angels. They're not the same. They're actually a different being. They're here to serve the will of man. However, man has a choice whether or not that would be to the good or the bad. Jinn on their own could lean in a range of good to bad also because they have free will as well. Then they're relating the jinn to familiar spirits. So I was like, well, what are familiar spirits? And of course, I know a little bit, but I'm going to lean on Wikipedia again here. In European folklore, the folk believed in the medieval and early modern periods that familiar spirits were supernatural entities that would assist witches and cunning folk in their practice of magic. And I had not heard the term cunning folk, so I had to look it up. Basically means like white witches or people that do folk healing, sort of energy healing that are very natural in their practice, and their intent, of course, is good. According to the records of the time, these familiar spirits would appear in numerous guises, often as an animal, but sometimes as a human or humanoid figure. and were described as clearly defined three-dimensional forms, vivid with color and animated with movement and sound by those who had said that they had come into contact with them. Unlike later descriptions of ghosts, which were smoky, undefined forms. I thought that was interesting. So familiars showed up sometimes as human, sometimes as animals, and they were very 3D, easy to see, etc. But ghosts were less defined or easier to see. And they said that when they served witches, they were often thought to be malevolent, but if they were working for what they called the cunning folk, those white witches or folk healers, they were often thought of as benevolent. And familiars that worked with witches were negatively categorized as demons, while those working with the cunning folk were commonly thought of as fairies. The main purpose of familiars was to serve the developing witch, the young witch, as she developed her attunement and skills, providing protection for them as they came into their new powers. Since the 20th century, there have been a number of magical practitioners, many of the neo-pagan religion, also Wicca, etc., that have begun to utilize the concept of familiars in today's world because of their association with the older forms of magic. And they utilize pets and wildlife and believe in invisible spirit versions of familiars to act as magical aids. We have our guides and our totems, animal forms that are around us. Pierre A. Rifford proposed a definition of a familiar spirit. He called it an alter ego or a doppelganger, a personal daimon, a personal totem, or a spirit companion, and said that it's the double or the alter ego of an individual. It doesn't look like the individual concerned, and even though it might have an independent life of its own, it remains closely linked to the individual. The familiar spirit can be an animal or have human form. The French poet Charles Baudelaire is a cat fancier, and he believed in familiar spirits and also said that it's the familiar spirit of a place. It judges the place and presides and inspires everything in its empire and is perhaps maybe a fairy or a god. And he says, when my eye's drawn like a magnet to this cat that I love, and he goes on, A.P. Elkin studied the belief in familiar spirits among the Australian Aborigines, and a usual method of explanation was that the medicine man sends his familiar spirit or his totem, spirit dog, spirit child, or whatever the form might be, to gather information, kind of serving between the two worlds. While this was occurring, the man might be in a state of receptivity or trance or sleep. The modern phraseology, using spiritism terms, his familiar spirit would be their control spirit. I've never really liked that term because, even though we might channel or speak the wisdom that's given to us through other beings, etc., we're the one in control, not them. But I guess it was thought of differently, maybe, I don't know. There's a really big difference between channeling and possession. For instance, channeling is just passing on the messages of higher beings and bringing through love and light and helping heal and bring good things into people's lives. Possession would be a hostile takeover of a negative entity with someone that has very poor psychic boundaries, maybe that have been destroyed through mental illness or through drugs or the use of alternate substances, or maybe even negative ideology and ideation. If you spend a lot of time hating on things or resisting things, it opens your vibration for energies that have those lower things. So again, we have that divide between light and dark, and our control of that is through our will. We can also choose to set our vibration within ourselves. Before we go to this next segment, I'm going to give you how to build your protective aura. This was given to me by another medium at a very serious point of crisis, and I'm going to give it to you. You would say, I your name, ask the ministering angels of higher intelligence and the teachers of my inner band to unite with me in the building and strengthening of my protective aura, so very, very strong that only the vibrations of truth, light, love, peace, knowledge, wisdom, healing, and understanding be permitted to touch, influence, or use me in any manner. And I thank you. If you tuned in late and you would like to listen to some previous episodes of From a Medium's Perspective, you can find them at youtube.com and just put in Medium Tracey Lockwood, or you can find me on my website at mediumtraceylockwood.com. So we were saying that usually it's thought that a medicine man sends his familiar spirit, whether it's a totem, spirit dog, spirit child, whatever form it is, to gather information and is in sleep or deep trance when that happens. Mircea Eliade talks about the Goldie people in Siberia and how they distinguish between tutelary spirits that they call ayami, which choose the shaman. Shaman is just another word for medicine man, medium, seer, healer, and the helping spirits. So we have the ayami that choose the shaman, and the helping spirits, which they call shivan, which are subordinate to it and are granted to the shaman by the ayami. So they're sort of spirits that choose the prophet or seer, medium, shaman, and then there are those that are subject to that spirit itself. According to Sternberg, the Goldie explained the relationship between the shaman and his ayami by a complex, rather sexual emotion. It's kind of odd, but I thought I would share it because it's kind of interesting and it comes to us from Siberia. So here's the quote here. Once I was asleep on my sick bed when a spirit approached me. It was a very beautiful woman. Her figure was very slight. She was no more than a half an arshin tall. Her face and attire were quite those as one of our gold women. She said, I am the ayami of your ancestors, the shamans. I taught them shamaning, and now I'm going to teach you. I love you. I have no husband now. You will be my husband, and I shall be a wife unto you. I shall give you assistant spirits. You are to heal with their aid, and I shall teach and help you myself. And he said that sometimes she comes under the aspect of an old woman, and sometimes that of a wolf. So she is terrible to look at, he says. Sometimes she comes as a winged tiger. She has given me 3 assistants, the panther, the bear, and the tiger, and they come to me in my dreams and appear whenever I summon them while shamaning. If one of them refuses to come, the ayami makes them obey, but they say there are some who do not obey even the ayami. When I am shamaning, the ayami and the assistant spirits are possessing me, whether big or small, and they come through me as smoke or vapor would. When the ayami is within me, it is she who speaks through my mouth, and she does everything herself. Sounds a lot like channeling, doesn't it? Anyway, amongst those that have been accused of witches and cunning folk that describe their familiar spirits, they had like several things that were the same. And historian Emma Wilby noted the accounts of encounters with familiars and how she was struck by their ordinariness and naturalism, even though they were dealing with supernatural entities. Familiar spirits had names which were often given down to earth and frequently affectionate nicknames. One example of this was Tom Reed, who was the familiar of a cunning woman. That just cracks me up, that term cunning person or cunning folk or cunning woman. Anyway, I just probably should just say medium, but anyway, the familiar belonged to the accused witch Bessie Dunlop, and other examples included Grizel and Gridigut, who were the familiars of 17th century Huntingdonshire witch Jane Wallace. That makes me a cunning person. That's weird. We kind of associate that with a lack of truth, but apparently there were the good witch and the bad witch. I don't think I'm a witch, but whatever. These are the ways that the encounters with familiars happen. The first is when the spirit spontaneously appears in front of the individual, sort of while they're doing their daily activities. They're in their home or outdoors. The second is when the familiar could be given to a person by a pre-existing individual who was sometimes a family member and at other times a more powerful spirit. In a number of accounts, it was an individual who was experiencing difficulty prior to the appearance of the familiar, and the familiar came to offer them aid. And I was kind of intrigued by the second manner of someone giving someone their guide, because when my grandmother passed, one of her guides, Elizabeth, joined my entourage. I already have a gatekeeper named Primrose, but Elizabeth came in to assist in that aspect, a joy guide gatekeeper position there. She's really sweet. Anyway, this is talking about people in difficulty when the familiar showed up. As historian Elma Wilby noted, were primarily rooted in the struggle for physical survival, the lack of food or money, bereavement, sickness, the loss of livelihood, and so on. And the familiar offered them a way out of that by giving them what she calls magical powers. Familiars were really common in Western European mythology, with some scholars that argue that they're only present in Great Britain and France. And they had three categories of familiars that they thought existed. One was the human familiars. One was divinatory animals. Divining is finding the truth in things. And divination tools, or like tarot cards or whatever. They had divinatory animals, human familiars, and maleficent animals. And I'm pretty sure maleficent animals would not be ones you or I would want around us. Emma Wilby identified this kind of pattern or motif in European folk tales and fairy tales, and she thought that some of the ones that you might know the stories of were actually a belief in familiar spirits, like Rumpelstiltskin, Puss in Boots, the Frog Prince. You probably know all those stories. Enough talk about familiars. What about angels? So I went to Bible.org to read a little bit, and so I'm going to read some bits and bobs and interject as I normally do from Bible.org. They say, we are not to think that man is the highest form of created being, as the distance between man and the lower forms of life is filled with beings of various grades. So it is possible that between man and God there exist certain creatures of higher than human intelligence and power. Indeed, the existence of lesser deities, all in heathen mythologies, presume the existence of a higher order of beings between God and man, superior to man and inferior to God. This possibility is turned into certainty by the express and explicit teaching of the Scriptures. It would be sad indeed if we would allow ourselves to be such victims of sense perception and so materialistic that we should refuse to believe in an order of spiritual beings simply because they were beyond our sight and touch. I firmly agree. While many details about angels are omitted in the Bible, it is important to keep in mind three important elements about the revelation that has been given about angels. There are angels mentioned in the Bible 196 times, 103 in the Old Testament, 93 in the New, and found in at least 34 books of the Bible, from Genesis or Job, whichever you consider the first, to the last book, Revelation. There are numerous references to angels by the Lord Jesus. This is their quote. Paul wrote, "For him by all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities." And that's a reference to angels. All things have been created by him and for him. Bible.org goes on to say, though other words are used for these spiritual beings, the primary word used in the Bible is angels. 3 other terms are undoubtedly referring to angels, although I'm going to contest Bible.org on the last one: seraphim, cherubim, and ministering spirits. Now you know why I would contest ministering spirits, because I think that angels and guides are entirely different. The Hebrew word for angel is malach, and the Greek word is angelos. Both words mean messenger and describe one who executes the purpose and will of the one whom they serve. The holy angels are messengers of God, serving him and doing his bidding. The fallen angels serve Satan, the god of this world. The unfallen angels are also spoken of as holy ones. The reason is 2 reasons. 1, they were created perfect without any flaw or sin. And 2, because of their purpose. They were set apart by God and for God as his servants and the attendants to his holiness. Angels were referred to as the host, which calls our attention to 2 ideas. First, it's used to describe God's angels as the armies of heaven, who serve people that are engaged in spiritual warfare. Second, it calls our attention to angels as a multitude of heavenly beings who surround us and serve God as seen in the Lord of hosts. He goes on and talks about angels being created. They are not the spirits of the departed. That's clarified in Psalms 148. Bible.com advocates that since God is spirit, it's natural to assume that there are creative beings with more resemblance to God than mundane creatures that inhabit the material and immaterial world. There is a material kingdom, an animal kingdom, and a human kingdom. And I'd like to say that the material kingdom I would look at as the physical world that we're conquering ourselves. That the animal kingdom would be the fabric of things that are held together to create that, maybe including the elementals. And the human kingdom itself would be our governments and whatever. But of course, there's also angelic and spiritual kingdoms too. It's kind of neat to think that there's an entire matrix about that. I cannot believe how fast this is flying. I am pulling pages aside and aside. I'll have to talk about angels specifically in another show because there's just too much information about it. I wanted to mention the elementals too. Now, elementals are sort of a similar concept to what we've been talking about. They're considered mythic or imaginary, but they've been described in a lot of occult and alchemical works from around the time of the European Renaissance, around the 16th century. And they have different categories, which are gnomes, undines, sylphs, and salamanders. They correspond to the classic elements of earth, air, and fire. Ether, which was not assigned to an element. They are part of the very fabric of our world here. They consider gnomes, that's that weird spelling of the word gnome, Gnome, to be a being of the earth, and the undines to be beings of water, and sylphs to be beings of air, and salamanders to be beings of fire. I find that really beautiful. We had a talk about different elementals in another show, and we'll probably have another one at some time as well. But those beings do help us in our life. What about totems, the animal kingdom? And of course, that would be the same. Wikipedia defines totems as a spirit being, sacred object, or symbol of a tribe, clan, family, or individual. Native American tradition provided that each individual is connected with 9 different animals that will accompany each person through life, acting as guides. So if you think you just have one totem animal, think again, there are actually 9 of them. You know, I like to differentiate between the different levels of beings and the different categories of them. It's just amazing to me to think about the fact that we have angels that work with us. We can access the wisdom of the gods and goddesses, as in the lowercase g. We have ascended masters that work with us. We have star people that work with us. We have totems. We have mythical creatures that do. We have elementals. We have our guides, our spirit guides that are with us. And we have the spirits of people that are around us as well. You know, we often feel really alone in our world, but it was pretty cool to go in that circuit to find that information about the jinn, to find that leading into the fact that they're talking about familiars, and familiars are similar to the angelics and, of course, the guide realm. That these beings are around us, and that those familiars and angels and elementals and totems are here to help. So it might be a good idea if you had a chance to get to know yours. It's really quite mystical, and it's kind of interesting to realize that so many cultures and religions are aware that we do have helpers, and the similarities between them are really startling, whether you're talking about Aladdin's lamp, the genie, your wish is my command, or familiars that assist us in our development of our abilities, or the biblical God that gave his angels charge over us and mentions the ministering spirits, the pagan and Celtic concept of fairies and other elementals, the Native American concept of totem animals, and of course, the spiritualist concept of spirit guides. It's just fascinating. We've always had amazing beings that support us in our journey through this material life. And I kind of wonder, do we hang out with them over there? Or are they just assigned to us because they protect the interface of our spirits with the physical body? It's really something to think about. I thank you for joining me today. I hope that you found today's show intriguing and giving you some new thoughts. We'll look to see you next week. I'll be sharing some more stories, and I want to thank you for joining us. If you'd like to schedule a private reading with me, I also tutor people one-on-one. I don't know if that's called a psychic mentor or what that is, but I do offer one-on-one tutoring and private readings by phone or Skype. Skype for international clients, by phone for here in the U.S. And if you're in the Roanoke area in my office, I do schedule them. So please don't assume that I'm going to be at the ready when you call, but I'll get you in as quickly as possible and at a time that works for both of us. Thank you so much for joining me for From a Medium's Perspective. I'd like to leave you with a little blessing, and that is that may today there be peace within. May you trust that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith in yourself and in others, and in the source of our light and love. May you use the gifts that you have received and pass on the love that's been given to you. May you be content with yourself just the way you are. Happiness is there for each and every one of us. Go in peace. We'll see you next week for a view of life from a medium's perspective. And remember, it's never inappropriate to be kind, and without integrity, you have nothing. Namaste.